Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about something that a lot of new photographers and videographers struggle with. We're going to talk about lens choices. Specifically, we're going to talk about focal lengths and sort of how they affect your image and what they allow you to capture. Check it out. Today we're going to be looking at the three lenses that I currently own, and we'll look at the advantages and disadvantages to each lens. Also, we'll look at examples of footage shot with these lenses from my family's spring break vacation. Before we get started talking about my lenses, let me talk about lenses in general. Typically, you have two types of lenses that are options for cameras. One is the zoom lenses. These lenses have a variable focal length, which allows you to zoom from one focal length to another. There are three zoom ranges that are referred to oftentimes as the trinity of lenses. The widest is 16 to 35, and then you have a 24 to 70, and then typically you have a 70 to 200. These lenses obviously give you a lot of flexibility, but with that flexibility comes a pretty high price tag. The other types of lenses that are oftentimes much less expensive are what we refer to as prime lenses. Prime lenses are a fixed focal length. So the lenses that we're going to be talking about today are the 20 mil, 85 mil, and 35 mil. All right, the first lens that we're going to be talking about is the 20 millimeter Sony 1.8. This lens is a great lens. It's actually the lens I'm currently shooting on. A few of the advantages to this lens. The 20 mil allows you to capture a lot of context. What I mean by that is as you're videoing an individual, it allows you to capture a lot of their surroundings so you understand not just what the individual is doing, but where the individual is doing it. Secondly, this lens works really great for small confined spaces. Because this lens shoots so wide, it does allow you to capture a small office or a small classroom, and in a lot of cases, you can literally cover wall to wall. Therefore, it really allows you to just show everything. Another advantage to the 20 mil is it really gives your viewer an immersive feel. The 20 mil is so wide, it actually allows your viewer to sort of feel like they're part of the scene, that they're actually in the room themselves. The last advantage that I'm going to talk about is actually the reason I'm using the 20 mil currently. This is a great vlog lens. You can walk around and hold this lens in hand. Also, because it's so wide, it's relatively easy to stabilize and doesn't show as much handshake as maybe a tighter lens that we'll look at later might do. So now let's talk about a few of the disadvantages to the 20 mil. Specifically, one of the first things that you'll notice with the 20 mil is if your subject begins to get out towards the edges, you'll notice that there's a good bit of warping. This happens with wider focal lengths generally, and it can be corrected in post. But typically you want to keep your subject in the center of the frame. A disadvantage to the center of the frame is at times, if you get your subject too close to the lens, you'll actually notice some exaggeration of features, specifically the nose or even the length of the head can become quite exaggerated with a pretty wide angle lens like the 20 mil, especially the closer you get the subject to the lens itself. One possible disadvantage to the 20 mil is you really don't get to hide anything. If you use a 20 millimeter in an office or in a classroom, you're really showing everything. The last sort of disadvantage, which may actually be an advantage at times with the 20 mil that I want to mention, is when you're shooting with a 20 mil, you really become part of the action. Because the 20 mil is so wide, in order for you to really feel the frame with your subject, oftentimes you have to get right in front of them or you have to get right in on the action. This can be an advantage in the sense that you and your subject can interact with each other, and therefore the audience feels even more immersed in the scene. In some cases, being so close in on the action can become a disadvantage because your subject may not feel as comfortable with a camera quite so close to them. In general, I love the 20 mil. It meets a lot of the needs that I have to be able to provide context as well as to work in small spaces. So if these features seem like they would be advantageous to you, then I encourage you, check out the 20 mil. All right, the next lens I want to talk about is the 85 millimeter 1.8. This lens is oftentimes referred to as the B-roll king or a beauty lens. I do have to say that this is probably in a lot of ways my favorite lens that I have. Not always my favorite one to use, but definitely my favorite results from a lens, because the images just look so much better. One of the reasons the images look so much better on an 85 millimeter versus a 20 is because of what we call bokeh, which is out of focus elements. When you see that blurry background, that's what we're referring to as bokeh. And an 85 millimeter just gives you large out of focus elements, especially whenever you're dealing with light in the background. And these really do add a unique element to your image. Because the background is so out of focus, it really allows your subject to pop and stand out. This is one reason it's so great to use in portraits, but also it really adds a lot to video in the sense of separation and focus. In my job, I really love an 85 millimeter because it allows me to focus in on my subject and isolate it. Another advantage to an 85 millimeter is that it really separates you from your subject. It allows you to capture relatively close-up images of your subject without necessarily having to feel like you're part of the scene. It allows your subject oftentimes to act more natural because you and your camera are not right in front of their face. A lot of times I'll be across a room or even in some cases outside of a room shooting into it, which allows your subject to really feel a lot more natural and at ease in themselves. With these advantages, definitely come some disadvantages. One of the main disadvantages of the 85 millimeter is it does not work well in small spaces. You have to be able to get back to get your subject in focus, and because it's so tight of a focal length, you really have to be pretty far back if you want any kind of context whatsoever to what your subject is doing and where your subject is doing it. And probably the last disadvantage that I would mention about the 85 is camera shake. Because the 85 is zoomed in so far, it's very noticeable when there's any kind of camera shake on the 85 millimeter. And therefore, oftentimes you need to use a tripod or you need to use a gimbal if you plan to shoot much on an 85 millimeter. With all that said though, I really do love my 85. I love the shallow depth of field. I love it for portraits. And I really do love it to isolate my subject and sort of block out a lot of the other aspects in the room that maybe I don't want to focus on in this shot. And if some of that definitely interests you, I encourage you to check out the 85 millimeter. All right, the last lens we're going to be looking at is the 35 millimeter. The 35 millimeter is probably the most natural look. It's actually a lot closer to what the human eye sees. The 35 millimeter works really well in small spaces, similar to the 20 mil. But it gives you the advantage to be able to control a little bit more of what's in the frame, more so than what the 20 mil will. Maybe not as well as what the 85 does. The 35 millimeter is a good lens. It's good for portraits. It's good for group shots. It really is a jack of all trades. But keep in mind that also means it's a master of none. Because the 35 millimeter is not as wide as the 20, so it won't allow you to get quite the amount of context that a 20 will. And it's nowhere near as tight as an 85, so it won't really allow you to get the separation of your subject off the background like an 85 will. However, I will say this, if you can only buy one lens and you're looking at getting one of these three lenses, then I would suggest the 35 millimeter. That's because of the fact that it really is a jack of all trades. It can work in any kind of context. It'll give you a little bit tighter shots for some of those events that you may be shooting, but it gives you that wide enough field of view to where you can use it in small spaces and still provide plenty of context. As I've owned these three lenses for a few years now, I find myself more and more having the 35 millimeter on at least one of my camera bodies. And that's because the 35 millimeter really is such a versatile lens that allows itself to be used in practically any context. Well, that's it. Those are my three lenses that I currently own and sort of what they allow me to do. I know I didn't get into other lenses. There's so many different lens choices out there. I encourage you, before you buy any lenses, to look at the options you have and explore what works best for you. I myself have decided on prime lenses. Even though at times I've questioned that very decision, I do love these lenses and I love what they allow me to do. Well, that's it for this video. If you found this video helpful, then please leave it a like. If you want to see more videos similar to this, then I encourage you to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.